You're listening to Up an Octave, a podcast by Sonivia, the podcasting agency that believes that women and non-binary people deserve to take up space in the podcasting industry because our thoughts, voices, and stories matter. Here you'll learn how to make dope podcasts that inspire, educate, convert, and most importantly, make your voice shine. I'm your host, Rue Spence, and I'm here to take podcasting up an octave. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Up an Octave. For this Pass the Mic episode, I had the distinct privilege and pleasure of talking with Chloe Corcoran from the Being Trans podcast. Chloe was an absolute delight to speak with, and I so enjoyed hearing her perspective, which is a little bit different from most of the shows that we cover, because Being Trans from Lemonada Media is a reality-style podcast, so the way that the show functions is a lot different from most of the other projects that we focus on in the podcasting world. So I think Chloe brings a lot to the table that we don't usually think about within podcasting, and it was just a delightful conversation. So a little bit about Chloe. She is a fundraising and engagement professional in addition to being an advocate for the transgender community. She's a 2004 graduate of the University of Rochester, where she played 4 years of varsity football and then served as an assistant coach. Chloe earned her master's degree at Northeastern University and is currently studying part-time toward a PhD in higher education leadership because she's not busy enough. Her work there focuses on equity and inclusion. Chloe also is the first out transgender woman to be named a 40 Under 40 award winner in her hometown of Rochester, New York. In 2019, she was one of 10 people selected from a nationwide pool of candidates for a Victory Empowerment Fellowship from the Victory Institute and has held multiple leadership positions on nonprofit boards. Chloe has spoken at multiple community events, co-hosted 2 radio shows, and enjoys photography in her spare time. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. As always, you can find me on Instagram at Sonivia Studios or on my website, sonivia.com. All right, let's take it away with Chloe. Chloe, welcome to Up an Octave. I am so thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, so you, for the people who may not know, you were on Lemonada Media's series Being Trans.
That's correct. Yep. And that was quite an amazing experience and difficult at times.
Definitely. So for people who may not have had a chance to listen yet, can you tell us just kind of like, how did you find out about the show? It was basically like a reality style. So you were followed around by a production crew. How did you even learn about this opportunity?
Yeah, so it was definitely a reality show on audio. And I was kind of surfing through Facebook, and I'm in a group for trans people in Los Angeles. And somebody put up a flyer, said, hey, they're casting for a trans person who lives in Los Angeles. And I was like, oh, I'm a trans person. I live in Los Angeles. And can I really say I lived in Hollywood if I don't audition for something? So I decided to apply. And after a lot of chats and casting calls, they asked me to be on the show. And I was like, great, now what?
So did you know any of the other folk who were on the show? Because for again, those who may not have heard it, there were several of you that were featured. So did you guys know each other going into it, or did you kind of form those relationships during production?
We formed those relationships during production. So basically the premise was the production company followed me and 3 other trans people around for 4 to 5 months, about 10 to 15 hours a week. So it was pretty intense, and they got a lot of audio that I don't know how they sifted through it all, but came up with 6 episodes that are about an hour long, and I would say definitely worth a listen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What was the actual recording experience like? You're in LA, so there's, everyone has access to a production studio, it feels like. But what was actually the recording like? Did you go to a studio? Did they set up in your home? What was actually making the show like?
We were all over the place. They captured me at home a little bit. I would do some audio diaries that I would send them when bigger things happened and they weren't around. And we did a little bit of time in a production studio, but that was mostly post. And then they would follow me around with a boom mic. And I would have a lapel mic. So they actually have recording of me playing flag football. And our sound person was out on the field picking up sounds. It was pretty incredible.
That's cool. I wondered how they did that.
Yeah.
Because there were some really interesting, so I'm a big tech nerd. And so just from the production side of things, I was like, this is so cool. I couldn't wait to talk to you kind of about how the show actually got made, because obviously the content is so important and valuable. But just from a production standpoint, I was like, there's so many crazy things happening behind the scenes on this show, I'm sure.
Absolutely. It was really ambitious for Lemonada Media to come out and say, this is what we want to do, and this is how we're going to do it. And we figured a lot of things out along the way, because really this style of show hadn't been done in an audio format before. So it's kind of like, well, what's going to work? What's not? It is really awkward going on a blind date and having your production team off in the corner. And don't worry, she knew that she was being recorded, et cetera, and agreed to it. But it was pretty incredible to see all the work that went into it and how they really worked with the people in the show to talk about things that I hadn't really talked about before.
That was kind of a thing that came up for me as I was listening. Was it hard to put yourself out there in that way? I know that for a lot of like my trans friends, I hear about feeling like you're on display in maybe ways that you hadn't consented to. Was that a concern going into the show? Was it a way for you to kind of take your power back and decide how you would be sort of on display? What did that feel like?
Yes to all of the above. It was a concern going into it, and I was nervous about how the story would be portrayed. I love storytelling. I think it's incredibly powerful and important, and it's really hard to put faith and trust in people that you don't really know to tell your story. But the reason I did it was I hear from a lot of people that, well, my friend wants to be supportive, but doesn't know how to and is worried about saying the wrong thing, so they just don't engage. So I thought that this was a good way for people to come and learn about trans lives and the trans community in a passive way. You don't have to worry about saying the wrong thing. You can just sit and listen and realize how similar our experiences all are. So that was kind of the driving force behind me doing it. I am not good at vulnerability. I've never been good with vulnerability. So it was kind of like they would come and they're like, oh, hey, can we talk about this? I'm like, oh, no, that's locked in a box over there. And then they would say, cool, do you have the key? I'm like, I lost it. And then they would just like, cool, we brought a sledgehammer, so let's talk about it. And we got through it. And I'm really happy with the way that they portrayed my story.
You talked about that kind of at the reunion episode of not being a very vulnerable person, being very private. And I was so surprised to hear that, because on the show, you hear some really personal things. I mean, for all of the participants, but for you, I mean, you got really excited to go on a date and got stood up. You were recording literally still sounding fatigued from an anesthesia after your facial feminization surgery. Like, those are some really vulnerable moments to be podcasting in. So I was surprised that, you feel like you really struggle with that authenticity when the show felt so authentic.
Yeah, so it was definitely an exercise and a practice for me. And the more I grew to know the production team, the more I was able to really open up with them. And some of my friends who listen to the show were surprised, like, we've never talked about this before. And they really brought it out of me through a trusting and continuous relationship. I mean, I spent more time with them, especially during the height of COVID, than I was spending with anybody else. I mean, we were getting tested weekly and all of those things to be able to be around each other. And it was hard. It's interesting to talk about authentic and vulnerable in that I view them a little bit differently. And ever since I started my transition, I feel like I've been pretty authentic, but some of the experiences I've had have made me be wary about the vulnerability, especially depending on who the audience is, who I'm around. And I realize it sounds a little weird just because I do have a fairly public life now. I mean, my story is out there for the world to consume. And I didn't feel like that going into it. And I think that was part of what made it a great experience for me.
I like the idea of authenticity and vulnerability being different. That's something that I spend a lot of time trying to get out of my podcasters is, what are you willing to show? Because if you're not sharing some of that intimacy, then I could probably just Google whatever we're talking about and read it a lot quicker than I can listen to a podcast. So that's interesting to kind of reframe where's the difference and where's the intersectionality between being authentic and being vulnerable. That's really powerful stuff.
Yeah, thank you. And you're right. If you aren't yourself, A, people know, and then B, people don't engage. People don't really feel like they connect with you. And that was a big part of, you could Google a lot of the stuff and try to get some information. And if I wasn't going to put actual life on display, then what is the point in listening?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are you still in touch with anyone from the show, whether it was another participant or the crew?
Yeah, I am still in touch with a few people. I actually ran into Sai, another member
Cool.
of the show. They were at a flea market. Not a flea market. It was like a queer makers market at a brewery, and we're gonna reconnect. And that I'm really looking forward to. I was in touch with Jeffrey for a while. I still keep in touch with the people at Lemonada too.
Mm-hmm.
They've been great in letting me, bounce ideas and other thoughts off of them. And it was really good. I think that the COVID of it all made it a little bit harder to maintain some of those connections. And I also realized that, I don't have a partner. I don't have kids. My time is a little bit more free than that of other people. It seems like at times, although I am quite busy, it's just a different layer of busy.
No, definitely. That's great to hear that you're still staying in touch. So what was your relationship with podcasting before participating in the show? Were you a podcast consumer? Did you like podcasts? Had you ever thought about participating in one or starting one before?
No, I had never really been into podcasts ahead of it. It was kind of new to me. I mean, I'd listened to a couple here and there. My experience with media was mostly through public speaking, and I hosted a couple radio shows. But outside of that, I hadn't really delved into anything, a few TV interviews, but that was about it. So I didn't exactly know what to expect. I just hit a point in my life where I was like, well, I've said no to everything for so long. Maybe it's time to start saying yes, and just kind of took it on faith that it would work out.
I wonder how that informed your experience with the show. Like, I wonder what choices you might have made if you had been like, oh yeah, I'm a diehard podcaster. I also wonder if that kind of supported the authenticity that we were talking about earlier, is that because you didn't have a preconceived notion of like, well, this is how podcasters behave, so this is what I have to do, that you were able to kind of just be Chloe.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I didn't know what to expect. And especially, the podcasts I had listened to had all been kind of explanatory and things like that, as opposed to, we're going to record your life. So I didn't have anything to really base it off of. I know some of the productions that the team had worked on before, and I didn't think, TV and podcasting are just so different, in the formats. But I think, not having a thought of, well, I should sound like this, or I should make sure I mention this, I think really helped the storylines come along. Well, I shouldn't even say storylines. I mean, it's just my life, but I didn't think about, well, I should portray it this way, or I should do this and that. It was just things that were happening. And I wonder if I could ever, now that you bring it up, I wonder if I could ever get that back again.
Yeah, or if like the toothpaste out of the tube a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really kind of an interesting thought experiment. So to kind of pivot a little bit, I want to talk about, after the show is out in the world, you've kind of done your part. I noticed that there is a fair amount of negative feedback on the show. I mean, the show is top 0.5% of all podcasts. Like, it ranked really, really well, got a lot of eyes and ears on it. But when cruising through Apple Podcasts, there's a lot of negative feedback. And actually just last week, I put out an episode on dealing with negative feedback on your show, and kind of, there's two types of negative feedback. There's like, well, it didn't really work for me because the audio quality, or it didn't really work for me because I wish you'd spent more time doing it this way. And then there's also just like, this sucks. And there's, of course, because you're dealing with the conversation of being trans or anything that's considered a different identity, there's, of course, this is liberal wokeism. how was that for you? Because I know being a private person, maybe you're not confronted with a lot of online criticism. I'm sure navigating the world as a trans person, you get it just on the street. But what was it like seeing some of that on the internet?
That was difficult, especially at first when I was going through. And we had a 5-star rating for quite a while until others kind of caught on and just review bombed us. And it was clear that they had never listened even to an episode. So they were just giving us 1-star ratings because they didn't want anybody else to hear what we were saying. And I think women in general find that a lot. And I think it's especially so in the trans community is there's just a lot of hate. And I was able to move past it partly because of what you referenced is I've taken so much abuse from people, strangers in the past, within and without the community. And it's kind of made it a little bit easier to brush that off because it's not valid criticism. Because I was a college athlete. I am open to constructive and valid criticism. Or like you said, well, I didn't like the format. Okay, I get that. But when you're just here, well, you suck because you're trans, like that's not a real engagement. That's not a real criticism. And I've heard from people about the impact that the show has had on their life. And that's been so important to me that it's absolutely worth it to put it out there to deal with some people who would never say anything to me in person, but get really brave behind a keyboard.
Well, and I think to focus on the people who you have impacted. I mean, that was some of the advice that I gave on the episode last week is, to pay attention to when you do find kind of the people who need to find the show. Are there any stories of people who you touched that you want to share?
Absolutely. So this was the first time I knew what I was doing was worth it. Was I gave a speech in Rochester, New York, my hometown, against the transgender military ban. And it was my first time speaking in public. And I stood up on this planter and people were honking angrily as they went by. And everything about me was shaking except for my voice. And it was a super hot day. So I was sweating all over the place, which is relevant later because after I got down and all the talks wound up, this woman comes up to me and she says, well, I just wanted to thank you for being up here and sharing a bit of your story and about the community. It means a lot to me and my family. It's such an inspiration. And I'm thinking, A, that's amazing. And also, well, who's your family? I didn't see anybody else with her. And then this little girl comes running up to me with a huge smile on her face. And she just goes, I'm transgender too. And I wept. It was so impactful because I realized that I was the representation for her that I didn't have when I was growing up. And that's how I knew to keep doing it. And I want to credit an author, Jennifer Finney Boylan, because she wrote a book called She's Not There, among many others. And She's Not There was the first time I ever understood it was okay for people to be trans. And that didn't apply to me, of course, at the time, but I understood it as a concept that, yes, people could be trans and that's okay. And when I was sending a bunch of my coming out emails, I emailed Jenny and told her what her book had done for me. And she emailed me back within an hour, which was incredibly unexpected. And she said a lot of nice things. And she also told me, Chloe, part of your job now is to do for others whatever it is you feel I've done for you. And I really took that to heart. That's what got me to stand up there the first time. And that's one of the things that keeps me going ever since.
Wow. I have chills. How do you feel about being like, quote, an inspiration? Because I mean, you're just a woman who goes to a coffee shop, and like
Right.
tries to live your life. So do you feel like, is it a privilege to be an inspiration? Is it an obligation? Because I know for some people who, quote unquote, live inspirational lives, whatever that means, you're just a person doing person things.
Exactly. So yes, it is a privilege and it is an obligation for me. I don't think it's an obligation for everyone. I just know that for me, I really feel called to make lives easier for other people like me because others did it for me. Like I am not here on my own. None of where I am today is just because of me. I am here because of the hard work of other people and the love and care of other people. And sometimes I couldn't see it. I just felt completely alone. but I'm still here. And that's because of a lot of them. And for a long time, I didn't think that, I would be here, that wasn't the plan. So I do feel obligated. And it was when I was coming out, I thought, well, there goes all my privilege. That's the end of it. And was very down about it. And then through the patience of some other women, it was like, oh yeah, I am still really white. And that is a difference. And that is a big differentiator within the community. And I started to learn about privilege and how much of it I actually hold within the community. And if I keep that privilege for me, that's a problem. Privilege is here for us to spend. Privilege is not here for us to hoard.
Oh, I've never thought of it as currency.
Yeah.
I really like that framework around it. Within that, how do you feel like your privilege was a part of the podcast?
I do think it was a part of the podcast in that I, first off, had a job that allowed me to engage in this way. I was working for East Coast institution at the time, and with the time difference, et cetera, they were helpful in that. And I was able to get all my work done while also engaging in important ways. So having the flexibility within my work to do that was really important. Not being worried about where my next paycheck came from was really important in that. Being able to get places because I have a car was a privilege in doing that. I think having the educational background that I do allowed me to engage in a way that I may not have been able to otherwise. There's a lot of privilege wrapped up in it. And it can't just be for me. It just can't.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously you're out, but did you have any safety concerns with being so publicly out? With, were you worried about, I mean, obviously you said you feel safe with your employer, but having such a large platform with the show, with it being backed by a network, did that cross your mind, especially as you started getting like hate comments? Did you have concerns about being doxxed or anything like that?
Yeah, I actually worry about that every day still. And here's the thing, I call it authenticity's forced bravery, in that for me to be authentic, it takes bravery to go get a cup of coffee. It takes bravery. I remember the first time I walked out to my car dressed as myself, I was terrified. My car was 20 feet away and I was terrified. So honestly, I live with a little bit of that all the time. And I think a lot of trans people do. We actually had to go through a psychological examination prior to signing on to the podcast because the company knew what they were doing and they wanted to protect us and make sure that we would be able to handle what was coming next. Do we have coping mechanisms and community and help and all of those things? It's hard even now when I'm walking around Los Angeles. I'm consistently a little bit nervous. I scan everything and just keeping my eyes, because I have had people come after me before. I've had people come after me physically. I've had people come after me with words, and it wears on you after a while, and kind of have to find my reserves at time to make sure that I can engage with the world in a healthy way.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. And even as a cis woman, I resonate with a lot of that. It's obviously very different, but just the hypervigilance that
All the time. Yeah.
Yeah, that no. And I'm sure that with how public the show was, that enhanced your awareness in a lot of ways.
It's, when I was growing up, I always heard, about like bees or spiders. They're more afraid of you than you are of them. And I kind of feel that way about much of society at large. Like we're cast as this big, bad trans ideology or whatever. And I'm like, I'm more afraid of you than you are of me. And there's a lot more of you. So let's just take it down a notch.
So true. So just, kind of on the technical side of the show again, how did you feel like they portrayed you? Like, obviously, a lot of it was editorialized. You said that there are probably hundreds of hours left on a cutting room floor somewhere. Do you feel like the narrative arc that was painted, did they cover things that you thought that they would cover at the end? Or were you surprised kind of by what the final episodes looked like?
I wasn't surprised by what they look like. I was definitely intrigued in that I wonder which, things that they're going to use. I wonder what's going to resonate with people. And it kind of reminded me of some of the research work that I've done, it's like qualitative thematic schemes, pulling things out of like this thread runs through it. And for me, I mean, talking about athletics, talking about children/family, talking about dating, those are all really big things in my life, among everything else that we covered. So it was nice to see that they portrayed it in an authentic manner. It's also a little bit different in that when you're wearing a lapel mic for so long, you forget that you're wearing it. And you're like, oh, I said that? And it comes back to you. You're like, okay, that's surprising because I don't remember it, but that's definitely my voice. So I guess here we are.
Yeah. And so on the topic of hearing your voice, a lot of people, it's like one of the biggest, squidgy points for especially new podcasters is hating hearing how they sound. And I know that for a lot of trans people, your voice can be a point of dysphoria.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like listening to yourself on the podcast?
Oh, it was mind-blowing because I have had some concerns about my voice, especially going into this project. I'm like, how am I actually going to sound? And then I realized that my voice wasn't as important as what was happening and what was being said. And that was part of the appeal of doing an audio show as well, is that it didn't matter what I look like because you could only focus on the words. You could only hear what was going on. So it's one less kind of sensory input. So hopefully you can listen to the story a little bit better. But I think if people are able to really focus on the work that they're doing, as opposed to kind of like the visceral reaction to like, oh my gosh, I sound like that, then I think that will kind of help shift like, oh, I'm doing this for a reason. And this is why.
And repeat. I co-sign all of that because it is, well, and there's part of it that's like, it's the uncanny valley almost because you've only heard your voice conducted from the inside of your head. So we don't really know what our own voices sound like truly. That, yeah, I spend so much time talking about like, you don't sound as bad as you think you sound. You're just so uncomfortable by hearing your voice projected. So yeah, I think that that's such an important thing for people to realize is that it's really not how you sound, it's what you say.
Right. And we're all, well, most of us are our own worst critics, and those that aren't maybe might want to take a second look at why they are a little less critical. But it's not about that. Like, I mean, I'm just rehashing what you said, so I'll stop.
No, I think people need to hear it a couple times over. So what is next for you with podcasting?
That's a great question. I am working on some ideas and meeting with a couple other girls to see if we can get something off the ground here. And we've had a couple meetings and we're going to pitch a show coming up soon. Not exactly sure to whom yet, but they have experiences. They're both Black trans women. They have experiences across the country. They have experiences that I will never have. And I'm just grateful to A, know them, and B, be involved with a project like this. And I've also recently launched my website. So if anybody has any ideas for me, Chloe-Corcoran.com, you can see what I'm doing there. I'm doing a lot of public speaking. I think it's really important to get trans lives, or at least a singular trans experience. I realize that mine isn't representative, but to put that out there for people and let them hear, let them learn. There is a lot of learning to be done. And part of it is just exposure. And it goes back to what you were saying. Are there safety concerns, et cetera? Absolutely. But the greater concerns right now in the legislative landscape, in the political landscape, all of that is far outweighs the discomfort that I have with my own safety.
I'm so sorry to hear that, but so grateful for the work that you are doing. And again, that you have kind of the shield of some of the privilege that you do have to sort of get that messaging out there.
Thank you. Yeah, if it's not going to be me, then, that kind of passes a burden on to somebody else. But if somebody else sees it as an opportunity, I also want to lift them up too and put them into spaces that maybe they don't have access to, and make introductions to people that they don't know yet. And I always say yet when I talk about those things. Well, I don't know how to do X. Well, you don't know how to do X yet. And we can figure the rest of it out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So on the show that you're pitching, do you think that you'll take more of a production role, or do you still think that you'll just kind of be in the talent seat?
I think we'll all be sharing in a production role on this as well, especially as we start to get it off the ground. And it's fortunate that I do have some subsequent podcasting experience in that, okay, these are the mics that we should probably be using. These are some considerations we should probably make. And maybe we record when they're not working on the apartment next door to you and those kind of things.
Well, I was going to say, you sound great. I know that there were some concerns that the apartment next to you is being renovated. What mic are you using?
This one is actually my laptop, but I did get a new laptop because mine was causing me issues on video calls. And I do have a snowball mic for when I do actual podcasting. So I've hosted a few episodes of other podcasts and just kind of in a moderator fashion.
I'm amazed. You sound fantastic. So this is just kind of reiterating that you don't need to spend $20,000 on a microphone to make a podcast.
Oh, absolutely not. No, I would strongly recommend against that. I mean, if you have $20K, you can send it out in the world instead.
Right? Yeah, no, just use your laptop mic. That is fantastic. Great kind of way to wrap this up. So obviously, people can stay in touch with you at your website, chloecorcoran.com, which that's going to be in the show notes. Is there anything else that you would like to share with folks or anywhere else that you would like for them to look for you?
Yeah, people are welcome to find me on LinkedIn at Chloe Corcoran and pretty much anywhere else. My Instagram is open. It's at Chloe Corco. And I'm always happy to chat if even if it's about opportunities, if it's you just need someone to listen to you, I'm happy to help and maybe help find resources for you if you need that. And mainly, I want to say thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on here and chat with you today about a various range of things, technical, non-technical content, hopefully giving confidence to people who are thinking about starting their own podcast too.
Thank you so much for being here, Chloe. I've really enjoyed listening to the show, getting to know you, and kind of hearing about what this experience was like for you and where you hope to take it next. So thank you so much for helping take podcasting up an octave.
Thank you so much.